Recently, I've been trying to frame more and more things from family pictures, original photography, huge canvas art, old college basketball jerseys. And each time I'm over here scouring the internet from different brands, trying to get the dimensions exact, hoping the materials are quality. And that's where FrameBridge steps in and takes away all of the hassle. FrameBridge makes it easy and affordable to custom frame just about anything. You could design and preview your final piece online, schedule to ship your items or drop them off in person, and they're great for giving special gifts to friends and family. Visit framebridge.com or one of their local FrameBridge stores in Southport, West Loop, and River North to start framing. Today on CityCast Chicago, it looks like the city is getting a new top watchdog. Plus, it is going to be very hot this week, and y'all tell us a few Chicago movies we forgot about. It's Tuesday, July 22nd. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. We've got executive producer Simone Alisay in the building. How you feeling, Simone? How was your weekend?
I'm doing okay. My weekend was great. My mom's in town, so it's going to be a good week.
It sounds like y'all made your way directly to one of y'all favorite places in the city.
Yeah, my mother requested that I pick her up from O'Hare Airport and take her directly to King Spa, which is the Korean spa out in Niles.
It's become a tradition for y'all when she visits at this point.
Well, now she has requested that every time she flies in and I pick her up from O'Hare, that's the immediate next stop, which I'm never going to complain about.
I love these conversations we have at the top of every week. We break down some stories we may not have gotten to at the end of last week or over the weekend. Last Wednesday, the city council overwhelmingly passed an ethics ordinance meant to expand the procedural powers of the city's inspector general. And then just a day later, Inspector General Deborah Witzberg, who we have talked to on the podcast, announced that she would not seek a second term, which some alders were a little caught off guard by. I know I was as well. She has been working pretty hard over the last few months to get this ethics ordinance through. Simone, can you first talk about this reform bill and then kind of talk about your reaction to her deciding, she feels like she's leaving the office better than she found it?
She even said leading up to the vote on this ordinance that pretty explicitly that she intended to seek a second term. And, it's interesting, too, because she also worked to impose term limits on this position. So now there's a 2-term limit, whereas as we'll kind of get into the history of this position, previous inspectors general have served for quite a long time.
I mean, she has served across 2 mayors, but it still only represents the 1 term at this point.
It's interesting because in its final version, this legislation, I think, to most people will sound...
It was a little watered down.
It was watered down, and I think will sound a little tweaky and inside baseball a little bit. But basically, the 2 things that the Inspector General's office was trying to do was make it easier to interview people or make it easier to make people comply with interviews or comply with document requests. And I think there was a little progress made on that. It wasn't nearly as strong as they initially wanted it to be. And that's sort of been a source of tension, frankly, between this office and the rest of city government since the office's inception, is just how much power does the Inspector General have to compel people to respond to that office when they are doing an investigation.
And it sounds like over the history of the Inspector General's office, they've had pretty good authority to go after, like you say, whether it's looking into streets and sands, which the very first ever Inspector General uncovered sort of a major set of corruption in there, where long-term connections to organized crime, a lot of people on the payroll who wasn't really doing anything. They have looked into the Chicago Park District, Chicago Public Schools. But when you start talking about looking into city council and their employees, there's a lot of pushback from the mayor when the Inspector General starts getting too close there.
Actually, up until 2019, the Inspector General couldn't look into city council. That was not part of their purview. The legislative branch wasn't included as part of that. The Inspector General's job between 1989 and 2019 was explicitly limited to the executive branch. So that's the mayor's office and the various departments overseen by the mayor. And yeah, I think, Witzberg, for her part, has sort of come out and said, I've done what I've needed to do. I've left the office better than I found it. I think on sort of behind the scenes, there has been a sense that Johnson maybe wouldn't reappoint Witzberg for a second term. They have clashed in the past couple years over a few different things. I think maybe the weirdest one or the most direct one was people might remember we've talked about the gift room and getting access to this room of gifts that have been sent to the mayor's office, and the inspector general wanted access to it and they were denied access.
It's a room that has existed prior to Johnson, but so much of the scrutiny came on top of Mayor Johnson because the story was painted that he wasn't allowing access to the room, to reporters, to the OIG. He pushed back on that in a lot of ways and was like there was a formal process to go through that a lot of people were not familiar with or didn't feel existed in very explicit ways. He didn't follow the recommendation of the inspector general when it said he needed to further look into ties between some Chicago police officers and far right extremist groups that recommendations to whether it was to fire them, to open up a broader investigation, that those weren't followed in a timely manner. And so, yeah, this back and forth is not new between the mayor and the inspector general's office, but it does seem like the writing may have been on the wall for Witzberg.
This is such a weird appointment, and it's always a weird appointment because the role of the inspector general is sort of, I don't think they would paint it that way, but I think the way you see these stories come out in the media, they're almost like fundamentally opposed because the inspector general's job is to investigate city officials, city departments, investigate city processes. Is the city doing what it says it's doing? And are they doing anything that they're not supposed to be doing? It's an interesting conundrum because as mayor, you want to hire someone who is gonna do a good job, both because from a political standpoint of you want to be seen as transparent and like that you're doing the right thing, but also I think just you want to be doing the right thing. You want to make sure that there's someone there who's kind of enforcing checks, et cetera. But at the same time, as mayor, maybe there's stuff you don't want being looked at too closely because it's working the way you want it to work. You know what I mean?
And during the entire history of Chicago's OIG, almost every single inspector general has gone out at a time in which the investigation they most recently was working on might have, we could argue, was the most embarrassing one for the mayor, whether they fell on the sword or not. The very first inspector general pointed under Daley, in this big write-up that the Chicago Sun-Times did, they painted his 16-year career as primarily concentrating on lower-level corruption. He ended up resigning under these allegations he didn't do enough to get out serious corruption after his office uncovered this connection to organized crime in Streets and Sands, where I said earlier, nearly 40 people were on the payroll, wasn't doing much work. The individual who replaced him, Hoffman, leaves pretty soon after, really criticizing the mayor for the privatization of the parking meters and that $1 billion travesty of a deal that we have long criticized. Joe Ferguson, who was here for 12 years at the time.
12 years. Mm-hmm.
Leaves under Mayor Lightfoot. And, there's a lot of contentious investigations during that time, talked about the unpreparedness of police during the 2020 protests, talked about the Lightfoot re-election campaign using city officials' emails in a way that kind of went against election laws, and so then he ends up resigning. And so the history of this office is the mayor seemingly appoints someone they feel is going to do a strong job of rooting out corruption. And then eventually the case gets too close, or they fly too close to the sun in the sense where the investigation really is embarrassing for the mayor's office. And then ultimately they decide to step down. That's not always the case, but it seems more likely than not.
It's tough. Well, and Ferguson and Lightfoot, they were like Lightfoot initially recommended Ferguson when Rahm Emanuel was mayor, because Ferguson and Lightfoot had worked together in the U.S. Attorney's Office. So they were kind of old friends. And then by the end, things were, a little chilly. They were a little more adversarial. Points that I think is really interesting in the history of this office is, under Rahm Emanuel's administration, then Inspector General Joe Ferguson was suing. And this is a case that made it all the way up to the Illinois Supreme Court. And at issue is sort of whether or not the Inspector General's office could essentially make subpoenas or enforce subpoenas, hire a private attorney to enforce a subpoena, essentially compelling a department, city employees to turn over information, right? And the ruling in that is so interesting because they basically said that, well, the way that this office is created in law under the ordinance that created this, right, in statute, is that you essentially work at the pleasure of the mayor. You're appointed by the mayor is your boss. And as a result, and also like anything that you are trying to sort of legally compel from the city falls under the city's law department. The city's law department can, decide whether or not to sort of comply with this. And basically it was sort of like you can't sue yourself. You know what I mean? Like that was the sense of it. And the sort of remedy that they suggested was like, go to the mayor and appeal to the mayor to allow you to compel other city departments, which the mayor also oversees, to turn over information. And it's, Ferguson at the time blasted the decision and was like, this means that Chicago doesn't really have a truly independent watchdog. I think, the sort of flip side of things is that like, you have to imagine that surely there has to be sort of some kind of protection, right? Of some kind of due process, right? When you're undergoing an investigation. But I think it largely can be quite a bit of an uphill battle for inspectors general when they're investigating something. The other thing that's interesting that we've seen in the past decade or so between Ferguson and Witzberg is the office focusing a lot more. And this is what we talked to Witzberg about a couple years ago now, I think, maybe last year. We spoke with her about how the office doesn't just try to find, corruption, isn't just investigating after something has gone wrong, is trying to do these sort of proactive audits or sort of looks at like, is this department working the way it's supposed to work? So we talked to Witzberg about it in the context of sort of 311 and city services and like, is this the best way to actually provide tree trimmings or building inspections or whatever the case might be? Or is there a better way to do it to better provide services to the people of Chicago, which I think is kind of an underrated part of the job. So her term is up in April of 2026. And so she will serve out through then, at which point Johnson will, we might have an interim inspector general, but she will serve on until April. And one of the main requirements for inspector general is they have to be a practicing attorney. And so, that's why we've seen appointments from Witzberg herself had been working in the inspector general's office. She was a deputy inspector general under Ferguson, but previous inspectors general worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office, Cook County State's Attorney, that kind of thing.
This episode of CityCast is sponsored by Babbel. Learning a new language opens the door to new friends, new cultures, maybe even a whole new life. So why not start that journey today? You can start speaking a new language with confidence thanks to Babbel's conversation-based technique that quickly teaches you useful words and phrases about the things you actually talk about in the real world. I'm CityCast CEO David Plotz, and I've been learning Spanish with Babbel. Just one of the 12 languages you can learn with it, including Dutch, French, Italian, which is going to be next for me, Turkish, and Russian. I love the interactive dialogues that Babbel has, which allow me to practice what I've learned right away, and also the speech recognition function, which makes sure I'm getting the pronunciation just right, which honestly, usually I'm not. Also, I love that Babbel's lessons always cover actual things that I talk about in the real world, like food, talking to people I've just met, and also food. Staying motivated to learn a new language has never been easier thanks to real-time feedback, progress trackers, and handy visualizations. In only 10 to 15 minutes a day on Babbel's mobile app or website. So get talking with Babbel. I want you to learn another language, so I'm teaming up with Babbel to gift you 55% off subscriptions, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 55% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
After a pretty breezy weekend, it looks like we have an extreme heat warning forecasted for midweek. Simone, what should we be expecting?
Yeah, so the National Weather Service is saying the heat index, which remember that's sort of the feels like temperature, could hit 115 degrees, which is really hot. That's bad. That's really hot. So the actual temperatures are sort of expected to reach near 100, high 90s, mid 90s. But when you combine that with 50% humidity, it's going to be clear skies, so the sun's going to be bearing down. It's going to feel like it is over 100 degrees across the city, with higher temperatures in certain neighborhoods, certainly farther from the lake, but across the city as well. And so as a result, the city is preparing. There's going to be opening of cooling centers, and it will be really important. It's going to last kind of a while. The warning is through Thursday night. It's going to basically, between now and Wednesday, it's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. That warning is last through Thursday. It could dissipate as we get into the weekend, but it could linger. It just kind of depends on how the system moves.
This got me thinking of a letter to the editors that the Sun-Times published earlier in July. It was called City's Heat Preparedness Plan, A Lot of Hot Air. We talked a lot about how the city has grown its extreme heat preparedness system in the decade since the 1995 heat wave. But in this letter, they talked about how the city boasts 288 cooling centers. However, a closer look reveals a perilous disconnect between official pronouncements and the on-the-ground reality. A staggering 110 of these sites are merely Park District spray features, hardly a realistic solution for adults, seniors, and individuals with chronic or severe health conditions. I just bring this up because I know every time we have these extreme heat warnings, we tell individuals to go to the city website to, look at all of the resources in their neighborhood, to check in on their neighbors. But I do want to make sure we're being critical of that system and always asking for it to kind of grow and expand, and also listening to kind of listeners and Chicagoans on what that looks like in their neighborhood, because it isn't equal from neighborhood to neighborhood.
As we talked about during the June heat wave, right? Yes, things have certainly improved since the 1995 heat wave. That does not mean that they are perfect or unflawed. I'm reading this quote from Chicago Public Health Commissioner, Dr. Olusunbo Ige, about how fans alone don't work. Like for something to truly be cooling when the heat is this bad, you need AC.
And some of the field houses in the city that are marked as cooling centers don't have central air, are relying on box fans, aren't necessarily fully accessible for people with mobility disabilities. And so
then the question becomes, like, what are the solutions if that isn't available to you? I think this is especially tough at night when the temperatures don't go down. But, I think during the day, trying to find any public space that you think might have central air. This actually got me thinking about our newsletter editor, Emmy Mack, wrote an article about malls that still exist in Chicago and around Chicagoland. And I'm not mourning the death of the mall as much as some other nostalgic folks. But one thing I think it got me thinking of was, like, that is a place where when it's hot outside, like...
Now, that was a refuge as a kid, for sure.
And walk around in AC for, several hours at a time and hang out, right? Flawed as they are, the cooling centers will still be open this week. And so you should take a look at that list. And if you've got any other tips for, like, places to stay cool in public, let us know. 773-780-0246.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to Monica Dillon, a registered nurse and works with Northwest Side Outreach Volunteers up in Norwood Park, who wrote that letter to the Sun-Times, really asking us to go beyond just listing the cooling centers, but making sure we are asking the city to do more, provide more resources, whether it's for park field houses, shelters, libraries and the like. So we will still drop links to those resources. If you can't tell, we are doing our best to keep you in the loop on all things happening in Chicago, whether we are talking about extreme weather to watch out for or giving you a local civics lessons on the Office of the Inspector General. Simone, why should people consider signing up to become a CityCast Chicago neighbor?
Well, I think for that reason that you just mentioned, right? To me, it's that thing of like, oh, I wouldn't have known about this if I hadn't heard about it on CityCast Chicago. Or like I gotta tell you, my very favorite moment is like when you hear something on the show or you read something in a newsletter and then you go tell somebody else and then that helps that person. Like that's the ecosystem at work. That's everybody's aware that it's going to be really hot, or everybody's aware or, gets to learn something interesting about the Inspector General's office. And I think that moment is so important. I know it's valuable to people. And so I think it's a good reason, if you haven't yet, to become a CityCast Chicago neighbor. That's our member program. So it's where you can lend your support. You pay $10 a month and it helps make sure that the show keeps going every single day. We can keep bringing this to you Monday through Friday. Jacoby, there's also perks.
You don't just get the civics lesson. You don't just get the neighborhood guides, the food and drink list. We don't mind giving y'all that for free. But when you sign up to become a CityCast Chicago neighbor, you're also going to get ad-free listening. You are going to get members-only events, this great email that's going to come exclusive to CityCast Chicago neighbors that gives you some of our favorite events happening in the city that week. And of course, like Simone said, you get to support us. You support us, we bring you more podcasts, more newsletters, real reciprocal relationship here, right? You give us a little bit, we give you a lot of bit, right?
Yeah. It's you give us a little bit, we give you something, you tell your friends, you're the smartest person at your dinner party, they tell their, like, right? And then Chicago is like more informed and more engaged, and everybody's just a better neighbor because of it. You see, where can they become neighbors, Jacoby?
Membership.citycast.fm. And you can sign up now or at any point. If like right now you can't get to it, then like maybe 5 minutes, like 10 minutes, maybe a couple of days. Membership.citycast.fm.
But like you are already on your phone. So you could just there's a link in the show notes, membership.citycast.fm. So you could just type it in and go.
And again, we dropped the hyperlink for you. You ain't even got to type it in. Like we giving you the place you got to go, but you ain't even got to do that. Just go to the show notes. Just boop. Whether you are a CityCast Chicago neighbor or you are just somebody who enjoys listening to the show, we are always open to your recommendations, your feedback, your responses, any list we put out, any bracket we create. That's really just our thoughts here at the show. And it's made up of some people who love the city. But it is always incomplete if we don't have your suggestions as well. Last week, we talked about some of our favorite Chicago movies. We ultimately settled on 12. We did the hard work of picking our top 3, but we want to hear from y'all as well. And Simone, people came through with some good suggestions.
Yeah. So Sean from Gold Coast texted us and said, quote, I know it's a popcorn movie, but you guys totally missed Transformers Dark of the Moon. 3 hours of Chicago being destroyed by fighting robots, chaos, mayhem, and fun. And I have to admit, Jacoby, I did not realize that there were 2 Transformers movies that featured Chicago. So I think Dark of the Moon actually takes place in Chicago. And then we talked about Age of Extinction when we talked about the Damon Silos, because even though that film takes place in Hong Kong, it was shot in Chicago, and the Damon Silos feature, I guess, in a pretty big way.
Sean, we have mentioned Transformers in recent weeks, and in our unedited version of the conversation, Transformers did come up. We did talk about it, but no, it didn't make it on our final 12 list. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't think there's a movie that did that I would replace it with Transformers Dark of the Moon, but I do appreciate the suggestion.
It's a good suggestion. Again, I'm just shocked that there's so much I think that's really my big takeaway from this. Mike in Printers Row said, quote, one of my favorite Chicago movies is Candyman from 2021. They do an amazing job of making use of the city for filming locations like Marina City Towers, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and what's left of Cabrini Green. Plus, they directly address a contemporary Chicago issue, gentrification. It does get gruesome. I had to cover my eyes several times, but it is still a great movie featuring Chicago. I didn't see the Candyman remake. I haven't seen the original. I don't like horror movies.
I did see the original and the sequels, and I did see the remake. I will say one of the most beautifully shot films. The cinematography on that movie is absolutely gorgeous. I didn't love the ending. I thought the performances were cool, but we did kind of talk about the Cabrini Green canon, right? And as much as Cooley High was the OG of that, we did talk about it as, in many ways, birthing this lineage of movies that includes Hardball, Hoop Dreams, Candyman, the original, and the follow-up. And so, yeah, it didn't make it on our final list, but it was in our heart, Mike. And I agree with you. One of the most beautifully shot contemporary Chicago movies, bar none. The entire time I was watching, I was like, they doing their damn thing. I just wish the story was as good as the cinematography.
You know, we did talk about the original Candyman a few years ago on the podcast. We did a whole episode about it. And I believe that episode features a cameo recording.
Yes, it does.
Of the actor who played the original Candyman. Is
Tony
that,
Todd.
am I remember? Yes. Which is a big Easter egg that I feel like listeners have slept on for the past 4 years
I feel
or whatever.
Like listeners agree with you, completely missed some of the flexing we have done in our time on this podcast. And the late Tony Todd, who passed away in November of last year, did make a brief, literal cameo.
A literal cameo, yeah.
And had a moment in the podcast. And so that is one of my favorite flexes of ours. And so, yeah, back when we was doing movie rewatches, we couldn't get away without doing a Candyman rewatch.
Yeah.
Wow movie.
Mike also pointed out fact about one of the movies we talked about, Chicago, the musical from 2002, which we gave kind of low marks on the Chicago scale. Main character in that movie, Roxy Hart, is based on a real Chicago person, Beulah May Anand. The story of her trial inspired a play, which inspired a silent film, which inspired a stage musical, which inspired the 2002 movie adaptation. So this is a real trial that took place in Chicago, and we kind of loop back around. So I don't know. I feel like that maybe ups the Chicago-iness of it a little bit, just with the history. Yeah, I could see it.
Yeah, I just went through a quick biography. I'm like, man.
And then one more movie that two different people messaged us about, which was High Fidelity, starring John Cusack. High Fidelity about
he owns a not so good record store in Chicago, and he kind of goes through the most memorable failed relationships as he's mourning the most recently failed relationship. But the saga of what they end up going through and where they end up by the end, John Cusack's Rob Gordon and his love interest Laura, their relationship has take some wild twisted turns throughout the show. I will say, great shots of Chicago, but I don't know. I just find Rob Gordon to be an insufferable character to watch throughout the duration of the movie.
I really unironically loved this film when I was a teenager and sort of a budding hipster and somebody who fancied myself as having the best taste of anyone around.
I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who wrote in, made suggestions. Again, our line is always open, 773-780-0246. If you got episode ideas, restaurant suggestions, movies we should watch, please let us know. Join me in giving a huge thank you to our executive producer, Simone Alisea.
Hey, thanks, Jacoby.
Some good news. I just want to give a shout out to the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame, which recently inducted 3 Chicago literary legends into their ranks, including Timuel Black, Oscar Brown Jr., and Harriet Gilliam Robinette. Please visit the link in our show notes and learn more about these legends. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.